So it's been, I think, almost 2 weeks since my last video, maybe a bit more. Um, yeah, it's been a crazy week or two or so. I don't know how to describe it, but I'm not even sure what's relevant to this discussion. But I don't know. I just feel like giving updates is fun. Business seems to be going well. There's a lot more coming down the pipeline I can't even get into now. I mean, I'd appreciate it if people liked, shared, subscribed to these videos, but I don't know, I kind of like my privacy, so I've got mixed feelings about really publishing and pushing these out there too widely, but I don't know, I guess what's the point of making work if nobody gets to appreciate them? Fun. So the topic for this week, and a topic that's been on my mind for a while, is this idea of extraterrestrial warfare, or war with non-human intelligences, right? And whether or not we're currently in one, what the implications of that are, like the idea of a race war just being a general thing that seems to come up in the human, let's just say, zeitgeist every so often, every time there's some major political upheaval, particularly in the United States of America. But it's not uncommon around the world. And, the definitions of races and just the weirdness of the idea of humanity and why, we can't seem to get along with each other despite being, the same species. I mean, it makes sense. Since we're all competing for similar resources and mating opportunity and, the basics that any other animal would fight for, it makes sense that, competition breeds animosity, distaste for one another, just general violence over scarce resources. So, which brings me to this idea of scarcity in general, and what would non-terrestrial or extraterrestrial species have to fight with humanity over? I mean, if you're a spacefaring race, you've pretty much solved scarcity. I mean, you can get as much energy as you want, converting asteroids or small moons into solar cells, and maybe there's a premium on organic material, right, or organic biodiversity, because you can still create space habitats relatively cheaply without having to face any competing, races. So that idea kind of becomes a moot point. And one of the things that happens when you start thinking about things this way is that it becomes totally illogical, or just really ridiculously stupid, like monumentally stupid, to, as one extraterrestrial race, to have a war with another, because one, it breeds animosity. Two, I mean, if they're an intelligent race, you then have to deal with the risk of your technology being stolen by them and then used against you, particularly if you're far away from your supply line and home base. So it takes, I'd say 2 years to resupply from your home planet, which is 200 light years away. This is given, faster than light travel and all that good stuff. So, or if they're sublight, it gets even worse, because the travel times are ridiculous. There's no hope for resupply if the initial mission doesn't go well. So you're kind of stuck, dealing with what you have, with the cards you have at the moment, and if they're inadequate to deal with the situation, you're screwed. And then you start getting into the issue of what that implies with regard to why a species would want to have a warfare with each other. So, as I go through this and I start looking into the history of this as just an idea, as a discussion, I start finding evidence for, well, like literally historical first-hand, second-hand, third-hand accounts of different species, not just like individuals, but whole species of animal-human hybrids, sort of things. Like you see them in the Egyptian mythos with Anubis, Set, Nipthys, just the Egyptian gods and goddesses. Very often animal heads with human body, which is an interesting conception. But then you start seeing them more in more widespread folklore, like the same communities that also had reptile-headed people or alligator-headed people also had pictures of dog-headed people, and like the dog heads specifically were cynocephalic. Cyno meaning dog, cephalic, cephalus, head. And those communities, evidence for those communities go back, almost as far back as civilization goes. Like, there are cave paintings of people with dog heads, and a lot of the time they were seen as like shamanistic interpretations, channeling the animal and the hunter. But then you've got, like early Christian writers and scholars talking about the dog-headed people, and that's when it gets really disturbing, right? Because like they speak about them as though they are contemporaries to themselves. Like they talk about like how do you save these people's souls and things like that. And the larger assumption has always been that they're talking in veiled reference to other races of humans, but then they start describing their language and it's considered barking. And even the Roman idea of barbarians, like they're described as speaking in bar, and like part of me wonders if that is purely their interpretation of other foreign cultures, which to a large extent is, but then I wonder if like deeper in like the psyche of these cultures they also mean non-human persons, like barbarians, like they're animal like. And then the idea of lycanthropes is a big one, particularly just because it's stuck in the human psyche. Because like the dog heads, for instance, were supposedly super just. They seem to have evolved alongside humanity, which is very interesting and has its own potential. Breeding. We could breed dogs for intelligence very easily, like very easily. With a bond. We do this already with what do you call them, sheepdogs, and these dog heads, the cynocephalic, were also, how do I describe them? Like they're described as shepherds, but also hunters. Still very much canines, carnivorous, but like dogs, they can eat a little bit of vegetable matter, but they're not farmers. So, like, their main source of calories seems to be protein, but there also seems to be diversity and history with these communities. So, as they progress in time, their cultures rise and fall. They have golden ages of their own, but their populations are generally described as small and isolated. They seem to live in fear of humanity for logical reasons. It's hard to know how they handle childbirth just because we don't have any info on that. And this discussion is kind of based on this idea of their presupposing. It's kind of just presupposing their existence to a point, just in order to have the logical throughput of it. But consistently, it's not just the cynocephalic. There's the Bigfoot sort of idea. One of the fun theories about them is that they're hairy Denisovans, which are another subspecies of humans that didn't die out. And then there's what do you call these? The Saurians, which are described as being among the oldest species, intelligent species to have evolved on this planet. And so there's this balancing act, right? What if, or not only what if, like, if the reality of Earth is that is a planet where multiple intelligent species have evolved over the history of the planet, some very interesting implications start to arise. Because, right, before the, what do you call this age? Precambrian, no, Carboniferous, yes. The Carboniferous era, there were massive insects. I mean, this was only, it was less than 200 million years, let's say 50 million years of history. They're massive insects because there's a huge increase in the atmospheric oxygen level, right? And the insects that we see in those times are very much in line with the insects we see today in terms of body form. But something interesting happens as we look into that, how do I say, form of life, right? Because cephalization, which is the process by which neurons migrate towards the head, create sensory nodes and whatever. Like, the size of insects in those eras would have been the size of, regular animals today, just because of the extra oxygen making it easier for them to grow in size. And if you had a praying mantis that was cephalized, so to speak, same massive eyes, same mouth, just scaled upwards, the increased number of neurons in their cephalus and their cranial space may be enough for the beginnings of, like, true intelligence as we know it. So that makes not just one, not just two, not just three, but now 4 eras in which intelligent life could have potentially emerged and been forced off the planet by environmental changes. Like global warming, climate change takes it all out effectively. Like that's a great filter of spacefaring civilizations, so to speak. As it's, that's probably just one of them. And then this problem starts to become very interesting because you still see like evidence of like insectoid aliens, right? And they're, one of the older species. They're generally considered more peaceful, but they're treated as though they come from the Andromeda galaxy. But I shouldn't say feel, but just by this course of logic, it may very well be that they emerged on Earth, much like the Saurians did before us, in a time when the atmosphere and conditions were very different. So now, the difference between the Saurian time and the insectoid time is there's a switch in the amount of atmospheric oxygen and CO2, right? In the pre-Carboniferous era, there was a massive amount of plant life that was seeding, O2 production, and the fungal life hadn't yet caught on to be able to digest cellulose in the plants. So they're just piles of wood everywhere, which make great spaces for insects, laying eggs, all this stuff. Right? So in the transition and the evolution of these fungi to be able to digest the plant material, the transition in the atmosphere would have been devastating to these species, creating a condition that, the increased CO2 from digestion of cellulose, which is, compiled CO2 into sugar and, long chain starches, right? So the breakdown of cellulose creates CO2 in the atmosphere. And the CO2 makes it easier for plants to go higher, which feeds plant life. And that plant life feeds animal life, and those animals spew out more CO2, feeding the plants to allow them to grow. So, as a result, you get big, massive herbivores, and those big, massive herbivores are able to feed, larger and larger carnivores, and those larger carnivores need intelligence, so they're selected for in those environments. So similarly in the earlier eras, right, where there's a massive, well, most of the atmospheric oxygen is produced by algae anyway, and it seems the Earth was probably warmer in those eras, so there's much more algae producing much more oxygen from the oceans, but also on land, those plants are producing much more oxygen. Just, it's like a beginnings of a runaway greenhouse effect, like trying to choke each other out, it seems to be. And plants were producing like something like 1,000 to 1 the rate, because when there's a lot of unexplored, I guess unconquered space, new lands, volcanism is still at its height in this, I guess I wouldn't say height, but just was a much more volcanically active period, even though it's a short one. I think I said 50 million years before, right? So it's enough time for selection towards intelligence to happen for sure, particularly because not just plants, insect life evolves very fast, and even in this stage they would have been herbivores, but the advantage for large insects was incredible, just because of the ease of using an exoskeleton, and to be it was a much more moist environment as well, so you didn't need the hard shells as much as the later vertebrates would have. So the selective advantage was there for large insects. And then as the atmospheric conditions switch, maybe by it's hard to know what the effects of a civilization would have at this sort of time, because combustion reactions would have been much more efficient just because of higher atmospheric oxygen. But I guess I'm kind of going into a bit of a digression here. So now the implications of having multiple intelligent species evolving on Earth over a 500 million year span. Let's in fact relegate it to the last 250 million years. So within that time we have insectoids theoretically as the first rung. I'm not sure if you can see my thumb. Yeah, whatever. Insectoids is the first rung, Saurians is the second rung, and then the mammalian as the third rung. And each time you have hypercephalization creating civilization, the civilization in its own self-interest wants to maintain the environment such as what it started as, whereas the environment cannot sustain civilization just because of its own impacts on the environment. Energy output, the reactions that we have create impacts on the environment that inevitably destroy the conditions that made the civilization possible. So there's a battle with entropy in that realm. And so I can see something like this happening with the insectoid races, just because one, much more O2 in the atmosphere made CO2 much more readily useful. You could burn wood, which is everywhere, a crazily abundant resource in this time. They'd be burning cellulose the way we can burn coal effectively. So, and then building materials. So there's a whole host and change in the way their technology develops as a result. And similar to with the Saurians, there's less oxygen, more CO2, so combustion reactions aren't as effective. But maybe there's more volcanism in that period as well. It's also a longer period of time, but let's just assume they evolved in the Jurassic period. So that'd be, the last 65 to, let's say, 66 million years, that 3 million year span, let's say. 65 to 62 million years, something like that. So that million year span, in that time they figure out their way off world, similar to with the insectoids. You leave And then you vaguely remember Earth as your old stomping ground. It's a holy land, so to speak, for your species. You keep monitoring the space and go forth. And, and prior to the insectoids, there's also potential for, intelligent plants. And that's a whole other deep research topic that I've still yet to get into, but okay, let's keep it to the ones closely related to current day animal life, right? So now you have mammalian species evolving, and another thing that happens too is that it may not just be that there's one species that evolves intelligence, because by my estimates there's, at any given time, intelligence is a useful enough trait once you have the excess and energy gathering and production to make it worthwhile to spec evolution points, so to speak, into thought and being able to plan for the long term. So evolution starts to select for just growth, the most interesting types of growth, complexity, and eventually leaving the planet. So now, why would these species be competing with us? And then it starts to make more sense that it's less a competition for resource and more of a holy crusade. And this is when it gets weird and woo-woo, just because religions, I think I've touched on this previously, but the idea of religions being a strange attractor with civilization to produce and organize behaviors of large collective groups of intelligent beings, right? Having a common belief system, whether right or wrong, objectively true or not, makes it easy for the group to behave in organized fashion towards effective goals and effective ends that help the species out en masse. Now, one of the issues that emerges with this is things like pilgrimages, holy crusades, issues like that, right? So there's always a special, how do I describe it, obsession with your origin point. I mean, and it's hard to say always because we're still coming from the purely human frame of reference for this, but so why would a species be obsessed with their origins? What would be the benefit of being obsessed with your origins as a species? Well, it points you to, one, histories and different strategies for survival that your ancestors may have gone through. Two, it provides options with regard to how to look at yourself, how far you've come. But it also inculcates the thinking of the species with context, how did our minds form, this sort of thing. So now, as you watch these species diverge through time, right? You're a species that manages to lift off of the Earth en masse because the conditions are no longer conducive to your survival in the long term. You leave, but you see those that you leave behind devolve, literally for, let's say, the mantis type intelligences, massive praying mantis species, things like that. You see your species literally get smaller and dumber through history because, there's less oxygen, there's more competition for resources, reproduction becomes the name of the game much more so than intelligence. And we seem to be hitting a crest like that with humanity now, and Like, this is where like the eugenics mindsets that you see with I think I mentioned this in my last alien heavy video, where as the species like moves further, they start to speciate more, and you know, the ideas of genetic purity and not wanting to spread about gets in the way of, you know, the freedom of exploration. So it disincentivizes a species from exploring if by exploring they diverge too much and thus become unable to share genetic information across the species. And you know, then you're creating a war, because not only are you now competing for resources, but there's no mutual interest, or there's less mutual interest because of the mate selection problem. So that becomes a very interesting problem, because we see the same thing happen with the reptiles, right? Like, the reptiles have gotten smaller. The environment went through a couple cold snaps, which is terrible for cold-blooded creatures. Like, there's just less energy to function. There's less, there's less food to eat. Yada yada yada. They start to shrink. Their relative cephalization, like the expense of maintaining a brain, is then augmented by the lack of warmth. So it just becomes a painful sight. The best way I can describe it, just watching what's effectively. This must have happened over millions of years for both lines, but you watch your brethren effectively fall apart. I mean, and just channeling what that is, emotionally and psychologically, is kind of devastating. So, I mean, you can't come back to the planet. The conditions are unlivable. You can't breathe the air anymore on your home world. And I mean, we see the same thing happening to us now with climate change, which, interestingly enough, our current mode of climate change makes the environment much more survivable for Saurians, just because of increased CO2 levels, but we still need to augment them to massive proportions. And the other alternative is increasing the oxygen levels in our atmosphere, because funnily enough, the atmosphere now would be more conducive to mantid insectoid species breathing freely in our atmosphere, just because the balance between animal and plant life has shifted. But it's not as stable as it should be, just because of human activity, our increasing CO2 levels, and it's not as warm as it was. So I'm guessing the insectoids wouldn't be as comfortable. But evidence has shown that this evidence is, a few blurry photographs and things like that. Because very well what could have happened, or one of the things that likely to happen is advanced camouflaging, things like that. So the insectoids that evolved on Earth, just maneuver. They have, low level to high level camouflaging abilities that are augmented by the environment and technology, wearable tech, clothes to bend light around them. And I start to see this analogy between Earth and this idea that I remember seeing in Star Trek called the Suliban, who are a species of alien that broke off into like 6 different sects of intelligent species, or subspecies rather, that evolved on the same planetary system, so to speak. Aquatics, mammalian, ape-like, reptilians, and insectoids. And then I start to see that, that they may just be an analogy for what really happened on Earth, and that we're sort of coming to that realization now. So, do these different species have agendas? Likely. are they negative or positive? I mean, it's just like human agendas, and like, I'm sure different species would have political leanings one way or the other. Like, they're still individuals within these species that would then have individual motives and then group motives based on clusters of individuals, and the diversity of thought that must come with that gets very messy, particularly if the insectoids are more ant-like than they are mantis-like, which means like less individuality, more pheromone or chemoreceptor based communication, so they're much more difficult to communicate with on a verbal level like we do, but they may have translation systems for conveying thought across a visual medium, because they would likely be highly visual just based on the insects that we see around us. But by that high visualization, they can also see wider ranges in the electromagnetic spectrum, which would help in terms of their technological evolution for sure. Being able to see polarized light naturally, and potentially even being able to see microwave radiation, and just all sorts of fun mantis shrimp-like stuff. And then you combine that with, like, let's say Saurians, who would likely be more heat sensitive and EM sensitive, the different ways your technology evolves that way. Right. So the question becomes then, what likely motives do you get based on these different types of evolution and technology, and whether or not there's shared technology happening, and what level humanity is in this whole multi-strata system? Because one of the things I've been puzzling with is the idea of previous eras of humans leaving Earth before major climate events. So, like an event that destroyed, like something on the order of 10 to 100 times worse than, Katrina. So it's not one city or state destroyed, but hundreds at one time. Enough to collapse global civilization because of a mass cosmic event, gamma ray bursts, solar flares, massive asteroids striking poles, creating global flooding, destroying cities, that sort of thing. Like, enough not to kill humanity off, but enough to make it much more difficult to survive in urban areas. So the culture collapses, all you get left are fairy tales, things like that. And I'm guessing the same sorts of events would have happened to the other species, just so they too would have multiple eras of humanity, or their humanity, leaving the planet, creating space faring communities, while those left on the Earth go through similar cultural shifts, cultural ups and downs, and golden ages and collapses again. Because, one of the big things that happens, particularly with this sort of thing, is germ evolution happens much faster than the large scale, like, animal evolution. So just the germ, I guess it would be germ isolation, I guess is a decent term for it. But just because, your microbiome may make you allergic to somebody else in your species' microbiome, even though you could still reproduce sexually, your being close to each other makes both of you sick, or one of the other sick, so you can't really mate. So it's effective speciation that way, but not genetic speciation. So something like that would probably happen much, much faster with these different species, which creates this idea of a necessity for, diversity, but also isolationism and just these ideas of purity. But it also explains why you have things like the anal probing being such a prominent feature of the abduction experience, just because you need to have a sample of gut flora to even have the potential for testing if you're compatible with one another and what germs to be specifically careful of, and so on and so forth. So now, why would you have infiltration, and basically combat stances between two species, right? If it's not for resources, there's no shortage of resources with which to harvest from other planets, asteroids, even the Earth, especially if you're deep underground. Like, there's hardly a need for combat over resources. Combat over genetics, that becomes a viable option. Like, genetic diversity trumping all gold. Like, health is wealth, literally, in this case. So, depending on how you as a species moved into space, whether or not you brought enough plant life with you, whether or not you have sorts of environments that are conducive to maintaining biodiversity of your species. And this is where things get very interesting, because, like, funnily enough, my guess is that the insectoid species, as they're leaving Earth, would have been able to create environments and would have necessitated creating environments that supported plant life with them, because they needed that much more of an oxygen load than we have today, versus, the Saurians, who did not need as much oxygen, so could exist with lower metabolic levels, didn't need to support as much of the external ecosystem, and thus did not need to support other life, and that creates a genetic bottleneck for them that eventually made their populations less sustainable in space, which would explain a lot of the idea that comes from, this idea of breeding experiments, but we're too genetically distant from each other to have direct breeding, so these would be like, artificial gene splicing to increase compatibility for, I guess, protein synthesis for consumption, for instance, could be one option. Interestingly as well, what would they have eaten? So we can tell that in the evolution of the insectoid species, for instance, they are likely to be a plant-based species, just because the abundance of plant material in that time. Actually, would they have been able to digest cellulose? That's a hard call to make. I mean, sure, we see them their offspring today eat plants, yes. I mean, okay, I'll give them that one. They're able to digest plants and process sugars, which again incentivizes having their ships filled with plants producing oxygen and thus supporting other species. Yes. Now, the Saurians, they would not have had a need to support as much plant life again. They would likely have eaten insects in large amounts. So that creates this interesting battle condition, is what I'd see it as. Them seeing the insectoids as a prey species, and likely seeing us as a prey species as well. I mean, I'm sure they can eat plants, but they're not getting anywhere near the calorie density they were, because even in the dinosaur times with the high CO2, there's less nutrition in there's less nutrition in the plants because they grow bigger, but they're less nutritive, versus in the Carboniferous, those plants were probably highly nutritious. So yeah, okay, it's starting to make sense now. So we've got sugar consuming insectoids, animal consuming reptilians, and then you get humanity, who are strictly omnivores. Like, we are omnivores. Like, we can try to be vegan, but our children still need milk. Like, it's like we still need animal protein to some extent to stay viable as a species, even like just as a mammalian issue. So similarly with the Cynocephalic species, the Denisovans, they all drink milk. I mean, that's what makes mammals mammals. So now this issue comes up. What side will humanity fall on in terms of the alignment between the two? Because one of the things I've noticed that's oddly consistent is that the the insectoids are treated as being kind, good, compassionate, and the Saurians are treated as cruel. Part of it, despite both their appearances being conventionally frightening, the Saurians are definitely given more of a villainous pallor to them in the psyche of the humans that enter these abduction experiences, right? And with that in mind, it just becomes this tricky bit of parsing out where interests lie and why they lie where they do. Because if now you have two factions, insectoids and saurians, who are trying, on some low level to terraform the planet back into conditions that are suitable to them to exist on the surface comfortably. Just because, planet-based life is nice. We are already considering terraforming Mars. And, the way Mars looks now, it was potentially more habitable to the Saurians, because same with Venus. There's a CO2 explosion that happens, and Mars's atmosphere is currently mostly CO2. So a guess would be that, though the idea of it being 65 million years, let's say 60 million years ago, they were able to terraform Mars, and somewhere in those last 65 million years, the environment changed sufficiently enough to strip the atmosphere from Mars completely. Maybe they dug a bit too deep, harvested too much electronic. Maybe if their energy was based off of geothermal power, they siphoned too much of the rotational energy of Mars, because they moved an entire Earth-based civilization over. Long story short, different, patterns for spatial expansion created different results, because what could have happened is that the Saurians landed on Mars, met the insectoids there, converted the insectoid atmosphere to a more Saurian atmosphere, which killed the insectoids but also further collapsed the atmosphere to the point of making it unlivable. So this interesting dilemma happens where you've got these two grandfather races, right, that are diametrically opposed to each other just based off of environmental incompatibilities. We wind up laying in the middle just because, mammals and... I wouldn't say mammals. We evolved from the reptiles. So, in the time of the insects, or the insectoids' evolution, the reptiles were still there as the prey species, and I'm sure a large number of the insectoids would have eaten mammals as prey. But the nutritional density of plants also made it less useful. And with that in mind, it just becomes this really beautiful, I think, pattern of evolution and transcendence from the Earth, but also what happens to those left behind, and the de-evolution that inevitably proceeds for those left behind because of, the inability of the species to manage the environment in which they come from, because getting to space is much easier than planetary scale management. And by the time you're able to manage a planet at scale, in all likelihood, you've likely been far enough from the planet that you can't mix with the population there anymore without getting sick, or and. I mean, the fun thing about or is that you can also make it an and in terms of what happens, but I digress. There's a twofold, you get too far and you're not even interested, and by getting so far and being able to move such wild distances, there's no interest left for generations until start to see environmental collapse, that you start considering maybe we should have kept more of those species that we evolved with around us to help keep us in tune with our home environments. So you come back to collect more biodiversity, to add more plant species that you can consume, and with that comes this trial and error process of efficiency, because I can definitely see the reptilians cultivating mammals for consumption, while they must also cultivate other reptilians. We eat cows, so why is it strange for reptilians to eat other reptiles? And then they're used to seeing the insectoids as a prey species, because I'm guessing they had a very insectivorous diet. Likely insectoids also ate other insects. And likely reptiles, but not to the same extent. Why would I say not to the same extent? Just because they would have been smaller. So it's like you have the biggest sources of calories being other insects and plants. So these weird, it'd be like us ironically eating insects. Actually less so, because insects are rather efficient. I'm trying to think of a better analogy, but it isn't coming to mind. But and another thing that comes with this as well is fungal intelligences too, and fungal clusters. And I vaguely mentioned plant intelligences and plant-based extraterrestrial life, which creates this messy web of how and why evolution happens the way they do. Because plants have much more complex genomes than animals, which makes sense in terms of evolutionary timescales. They've had much longer to evolve as a definitive line, or definitive sets of lines. But then the problem becomes the competition, right? So intelligent competition, and how you compete with another race once you manage to develop to a point that you can handle planetary scale logistics and economic modeling, like to a T. So you come to Earth and you find, oh wait, we're no longer the masters, it's been 1,000,000 years or so. Because I'm picturing that once you get to be a spacefaring race, you lose a lot of the impetus to settle on planets, just because settling on foreign planets, like let's say extraterrestrial planets, is much more challenging. So they only become excursions, and you find a planet that's much more suitable and stable environmentally, so that may become a new home planet. And then you manage those oxygen levels much better than you did on your home world, just because you're able to create systems from the get-go to keep a homeostasis with the atmospheric levels. So those become your new home planets, while your original home planet continues to degrade, just because the culture there isn't set up for management. The distances make back and forth information sharing that much more difficult. So there is a, divergence that happens in terms of the development of the species. So then this calamity happens on your home planet, and the cities start to disappear, cultures go, and you can't possibly imagine bringing back, migrating your force back from your old world, from your new world to your old world, just because it's stupid to. I mean, the environment was already bad when you were leaving, and now it's gotten worse, and you're stable on another planet somewhere with a much more stable environment, probably on a dimmer sun, and you've created a virtual utopia for your species just because, you're managing resources better. You've used what you've learned in terms of management skills to keep your species alive through space and then on another world. But the idea of your home planet still bears significance on a psychological scale. So explorations continue back to the homeworld to monitor life and to seed intelligence, just because it's a holy writ, so to speak. And then, as this occurs, effectively, I could definitely see the insectoid seeding Saurian intelligence. And similar to with cubensis, mushrooms seeding all intelligence on this planet. Plant intelligence included. And that becomes sort of epic and takes on massive religious connotations. And this is why it comes back to this idea of holy wars and purity wars and all that good stuff, because you all of a sudden develop a cosmic theory of mind and of evolution and of intelligence as being a self-seeding process, and the necessities of your species propagating and successfully navigating the space come in stark, let's say, opposition to creating your own competition. Because if you're seeding intelligence on the planet, are you also creating competition for yourself in the stars? What happens when, I guess the insectoids created Saurians, and Saurians see them as prey species. So then would Saurians want to create humans in such a way as to see Saurians as prey species? Likely not. So you see a vested interest in pacification of the new, the new child species, so to speak. And then this starts to become a series of psychic wars. The challenge becomes managing the minds of the child species before they explore out into the stars. And, start looking for planets that you may have already settled. And, deciding what to do about that. And, interestingly enough, there's no guarantee that life on these planets continues to survive as stably as they did on Earth. So, most likely, it'll be the subsets that stay largely space-bound that survive best, just because the environment in space is, though more challenging, also more stable. Deep space is hardly anything there. Planetary environments are subject to weather patterns and massive changes created by suns and solar events. So you can prepare for the worst of solar events and just keep yourself in what's effectively a Faraday cage, and just have a decent amount of EM and radiation protection in terms of hull design and things like that. Whereas on the planet, there's a lot more variation in terms of weather, in terms of scale of energy output. I mean, sure, you have solar weather too, and gamma ray bursts and things like that, but there is a level of being able to project these sorts of things, and just being out there makes it easier to project, because once you settle on a planet, there is a temptation to be fruitful and multiply, and multiplication doesn't necessarily mean it's happening in an ideal way, so you get situations where, dumb people have dumb kids, so I mean, it's not a guaranteed thing. Like, it's highly reductive to say something like that. But if that's a general trend that we see with happening across species, then you start seeing reasons why, breeding cycles and things like that become highly regulated and regimented. And the human evolutionary path right now being, falling in love, the messiness of finding relationships, the lack of ritual. I mean, in human cultures of the past, there were matchmaking rituals. There were this idea of the elders choosing good matches based on family histories, potential earnings, these sorts of things to guarantee best outputs for their children. And these cultures seem to have succeeded very well throughout history. I mean, we still have arranged marriages happening in India to a large extent. Similarly to, other Asian cultures, even like African cultures, have a level of this, though they're much more, I wouldn't want to say westernized, but definitely there's much more influence from Western culture, specifically from the religious realm, and so there's less obsession over how to create the next peer and match because sexuality gets suppressed. Which brings me back to this idea of culture wars and wars between species, right? Because the most powerful tool for an alien species to have is mass hypnosis and mass psychosis of the opposing species, right? Imagine if the insectoids were worshipped by the Saurians before the Saurians started to eat them. That idea starts to make more sense when you start seeing, the way we worship the snake-headed people. Like, even the Cynocephalic got worshipped, but they were associated with death, with Anubis, for instance. And with this further development, you start to see issues develop with the idea of godhood and the way depictions of God and the idea of being made in the image of God starts to form, where different religions have different treatments of sexuality and the interests of the progenitor species in terms of how they advance the child species and what sexual graces, what qualities are encouraged to reproduce. Because one of the puzzling things for me has been the idea that the best humans, or let's not say the best humans, but the most suitable humans for humanity to develop as fast as possible do not reproduce nearly as fast as those that would be deemed better workers. And for instance, with Buddhism, monks generally have a level head, good at cooperating, but also independent thinking and ideas, but they're relegated to leftover materials, right? It's the warlike that are encouraged to reproduce the most. It is the serfs that are encouraged to reproduce, but not the intelligentsia amongst humanity. And that's always bothered me in terms of it makes no sense in the long run for the species. But then you see religions like Judaism that have specific provisions that encourage a multifaceted priesthood, where you could be a rabbi and serve in their army while also having a wife. It's a fully rounded individual that's able to successfully produced. Whereas, I mean, in India, there's a similar thing like that with brahmacharya and the movement from being a student to a householder. In terms of, there's not an expectation as much as, I guess you'd say, Christianity, to be celibate and to produce and to not produce offspring, because but then once you look into the development of these religions in terms of their interactions with extraterrestrials, you start to see that there's a vast difference in the alien subspecies that would theoretically have influenced them, right? Because the Egyptians, for instance, seem to have had a lot more interaction with the Cynocephali and the Saurians than the ancient Indians did. Though the ancient Indians had much more interactions with the Cynocephalic, the dogheads, than they did with the Saurians. And the cultures that interacted with the Saurians most also had pacified, priesthoods, like intelligentsia. So, interestingly enough, that trend holds through the Semitic religions, whereas one of the things that probably separated the people of not Noah, Abraham, from the cultures of Ur was a separation from the Saurian influence, because the ancient Sumerians had a deep Saurian tie from, just based on their ancient artifacts, lots of snake heads, lots of reptile headed folks being gods and elevated species like that. But there's a massive departure in the creation of the Abrahamic faith, but not as much in the in the Latin faiths, because they also had deep ties to Saurians, just based on their mythos, and being in a volcanically active region also opened themselves up to deep underground civilizations, and that influence combined with this idea of vestal virginity, and again, the women selected to be vestal virgins were again cream of the crop. Who would be the Ivy educated women today, the best educated, and not just the best educated, the best capable of maintaining their education and position, the best thinkers of their time, as women would be removed from the reproductive cycle. And having that be the model for the religion gets warped in terms of time, and then you start to see the degradation of the civilizations that moves forward. So that leads me to think and, conclude that the Saurian trace on human thinking has been such as to not only pacify human thinking, but also reduce our effectiveness towards intelligence and selecting for intelligence and how we mate and make our mate choices. And that makes sense because, again, psychosis is the most effective weapon we have against groups. Like, if you want to battle a group, what better way to destroy them than from within? And that mess, that starts to make you wonder about modern culture and a lot of why we act the way we act, why we do the things we do, and who's pulling the strings and why. Oh man, I can get more into it, but this is going long already, and I'm not really in the mood for another 1.5 hour video. So thank you for listening. Like, share, and subscribe. If you got through all this, I applaud you. I guess I can talk a bit about the background this week. It's, I guess, a reminiscent of space going in and out at the same time. Just folds, ripples. I've been thinking a lot about neutrino tech, technology that uses neutrinos, which are outputs from nuclear events, usually nuclear reactors, or like outputted from the sun. Like the estimate is that like if you had a neutrino shoot through 2 miles of lead, it would only 2 miles straight of lead. Only one of those neutrinos would react out of like hundreds and thousands of millions. So billions upon billions of neutrinos, only one interacts with a pool of lead, miles thick, right? So then different ways of capturing that energy from neutrinos, because they do carry mass and energy, but they're just weakly interacting. And you know, the fun things you can do with that sort of energy, and then further like expansion into vacuum energies and things like that. So this is kind of a visual representation of some of those ideas. Yeah. Oh, there's a lot more I want to get into, but I guess I'll think more about it and come back to you with some of that. Peace.